Thank you very much. Thank you, Venkat. That was an incredibly generous introduction. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Today's project is a presentation is a work in progress that has emerged from my book project on the aesthetics of anti-colonial democratic critique between South Asia and North America. Unlike the book, which focuses on metaphors of communal reading and anti-colonial writing, this essay shifts slightly to consider the practice of aesthetic consumption more broadly. It focuses on Bhagat Singh, a major figure in Indian anti-colonial history, though he's not particularly well known outside of South Asia. In India, there have been multiple films made about him, the best, I think, being Rang the Basanti in 2006. And in Punjab, in both Pakistan and India, his iconic visage is impossible to avoid. My previous work on Bhagat Singh has been an attempt to untether Bhagat Singh from his post-colonial hagiography, both popular and academic, and then resuscitate him as a more radically egalitarian revolutionary thinker than the kind of traditionally more masculinist and authorial narratives of revolution usually allow. But before I begin, I should refresh our memory on Bhagat Singh. So, you might recognize this handsome man from the poster. Bhagat Singh was born in 1907 in what is now Pakistani Punjab to a family of well-educated Sikh agitators. In 1927, at the age of 20, he and other Lahori students founded the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, inspired both by Giuseppe Mazzini's Young Italy and the Irish Republican Army, and wrote manifestos on anticolonial revolution, pedagogy, and socialism. In 1928, Bhagat Singh sought to avenge the death of Punjabi nationalist Lala Lajpat Rai and assassinated Superintendent Police J.P. Saunders. In order to escape Lahore, Bhagat Singh famously removed his turban, shaved his hair, and donned a British trilby. Passing as a white British citizen with his co-conspirator Chandrasekhar Azad as his dark-skinned servant, he famously escaped to Delhi and evaded police capture. In early 1929, Bhagat Singh and Batukweshwar Dutt decided to turn themselves in to gain publicity for the HRSA cause. Against the wishes of the other members of the HRSA, Bhagat Singh and Dutt created a smoke bomb and printed hundreds of tracts that read, "It takes a loud voice to make the deaf hear," and snuck into the Central Legislative Assembly in Delhi, where Motilal Nehru's Congress Party was slowly and lurchingly debating its next co-legislation with the British. Bhagat Singh fired a gun in the air, yelled "Inqilab Zindabad," long live revolution, and threw a smoke bomb and the tracts. The smoke bomb, which was designed to hurt no one, appeared to explode like a book, as these quotes from Auguste Roland, the French anarchist, fluttered in the air. Bhagat Singh and Dutt awaited their arrest, and Bhagat Singh was sentenced to death. In jail, Bhagat Singh gained immense popularity by staging hunger strikes and publicly debating M.K. Gandhi in Gandhi's own Young India. And the HRSA carefully cultivated his celebrity status in Punjab. So you can see here this kind of famous iconography of Bhagat Singh lives on, and this is shortly after his death. Bhagat Singh was such a threat to the British Raj that they secretly expedited his hanging, and in the early morning of 23 March 1931, hanged and burned Bhagat Singh and fellow HRSA member Sukhdev outside of Lahore. Historians of Bhagat Singh have been eager to recuperate his extensive and expansive collection of writing, which reflects, as Bipin Chandra notes, a political philosophy in motion. Hagiography of Bhagat Singh appears to have started as early as his death in 1931. Collected writings and commentary on his philosophy started appearing in the 1950s. Scholars, eager to claim Bhagat Singh as one of the proper leaders of Indian anti-colonialism and Indian independence, point to the philosophical sophistication on display in his published essays, as well as this masculine bomb-throwing as a sign of anti-colonial mastery. I think the desire here is to equate anti-colonial action to colonial power, but sadly this does so without questioning, challenging, or rethinking the very colonial logics of that type of power. I don't think this was as simple. I think Bhagat Singh thought this was much more complicated than this. In response, in following him, I want to suggest that an analysis that draws on Bhagat Singh's writings should rethink Bhagat Singh's anti-colonial vision as a refusal of the colonial logic of authority and expertise. In other words, what I want to do is reimagine anti-colonialism as anti-authoritarianism and ask what aesthetic forms of the refusal of authority takes in the face of colonial rule. So with that in mind, the paper that I'm giving today has 3 parts, all of which kind of circle around a question that I'm asking about Bhagat Singh's kind of philosophy of anti-authoritarianism. Number 1, politics. In 1862, when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he might have said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." 10 years prior, Stowe had written Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, a sentimentalist abolitionist novel that was second only to the Bible in the number of copies it sold globally in the 19th century. It is highly unlikely that Lincoln uttered this famous sentence to Stowe. Indeed, the apocryphal greeting only appeared in print in 1896 after both Stowe and Lincoln had died. Nevertheless, the line remains central not only to literary accounts of the U.S. Civil War, but but also to the undergirding humanities philosophy that connects aesthetic consumption to politics throughout the 20th century. The belief here is that books can create or dismantle bombs, that reading can rescue the oppressed, and that readers are always revolutionaries in potentia. This is certainly a line that I follow almost always. So allow me to continue following this line of thought for the first part of the essay, and then to quibble with it the second and third parts. Allow me also this completely counterfactual claim that Lincoln did greet Stowe with this line, and moreover, that unbeknownst to him, he was referring not to the US Civil War, but to the long and great war of Indian independence from the British. Perhaps our fictional psychic Lincoln was imagining Saturday, November 17th, 1928, a fateful day well beyond his lifetime. That day in Lahore, Indian anti-colonial leader Lala Lajpat Rai succumbed to injuries resulting from having been beaten brutally by British police a few weeks earlier. Rai had managed, despite his injuries, to, quote, declare that the blows struck at me today will be the last nails in the coffin of British rule in India. Later that night, 2 cinemas in Lahore premiered a silent film that the British had deemed appropriate for Indian audiences. Directed by Harry A. Pollard and released by Universal Pictures, the film was the 13th silent adaptation in as many years of the best-selling novel of the 19th century. Newspapers advertised it as the best adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin to date, starring Margarita Fisher and Mona Ray in blackface as slaves, George Siegman as Simon Legree, and black actor, the first black actor to play Uncle Tom, James B. Lowe, as Uncle Tom. Anti-colonial agitator Bhagat Singh did not witness the beating or the death of Lala Lajpat Rai, but declared that he would avenge Rai's death by assassinating the superintendent of police who ordered the lathi charge, James A. Scott. Later that evening, he probably did not see Uncle Tom's Cabin on its opening night. But the young agitator and his colleagues soon saw it after its release. Bhagwan Das Mahur, a colleague of Bhagat Singh's, recalls, quote, "We came to know from posters that a film, Uncle Tom's Cabin, was being shown in Lahore. Bhagat Singh proposed this revolutionary film, which shows the blacks' fights for their freedom in America, must be seen. Eventually, we saw the movie. It was excellent. Bhagat Singh gave a very impressive lecture on the film and underlined the usefulness of it for the revolutionaries." And this is the advertisement for in the Lahore Tribune for Uncle Tom's Cabin screening. Advertisements in the Lahore Tribune corroborate that Pollard's Uncle Tom's Cabin iteration was screening in Lahore the night of Lala Lajpat Rai's death. It stayed in Lahore through December 1928, showing alternatively with Wings, the first film to be awarded an Oscar and also one of Bhagat Singh's favorite films. It's difficult to imagine at first glance what about Uncle Tom's Cabin could be useful to the revolutionaries. The bulk of the interpretive history of the novel in the wake of U.S. Reconstruction has tended to focus on its negative stereotypes of black people, mammies, pickaninnies, and blindly obedient slaves that only reinforce the genteel racism still alive today. Although Stowe wrote that Uncle Tom should be, quote, a noble hero, his name is more commonly an epithet for black people who support or apologize for structures for white supremacy. Even as an abolitionist text, its plot is propelled almost exclusively by well-meaning white people. Christian love, rather than economic or political emancipation, is the mechanism by which humanity is generously extended from white people to their black colleagues. Inspired by Quaker politics and written for a white abolitionist audience, Uncle Tom, the ostensibly titular black protagonist, simply endures passively while a chorus of white people sell, save, beat, kill, and are ultimately forgiven by him. Bhagat Singh was no Uncle Tom, even in the most generous intellectual interpretations of the novel. Unable to stand by and wait for revolution to occur, Bhagat Singh repeatedly argued for revolt in the continual present, Inqilab Zindabad, and for in the active voice. In his own words, quote, "Are the people who are crying for universal brotherhood or cosmopolitanism from the housetops really interested in bringing it about? For that imagined peace, we will have to sacrifice the real present. For that imagined peace, we will have to create chaos." I've written elsewhere that Bhagat Singh's claims to universal brotherhood, cosmopolitanism, and peace are metonymically claims about a love for humanity. This love does not neatly align with Uncle Tom's kind of politely enduring Christian love, but does maintain some of its desired ethical and political claims, namely that a claim of humanity must be a political and ethical claim, a kind of configuration of affective egalitarianism, love, or prem or ishq, kind of circulating the wordy vocabulary. But Bhagat Singh's revolutionary fervor would not have allowed for the same type of self-sacrificial passiveness that marks Uncle Tom's martyrdom. Bhagat Singh's love was marked by a willingness and a desire to be the catalyst of revolution, as well as of his own death. And we can talk more in Q&A about the kind of difference between the kind of traditions, the traditional differences between Christian martyrdom and Sikh martyrdom, I think, which actually kind of feature very strongly through here. What then did Bhagat Singh see in Uncle Tom's Cabin? The answer, I think, lies in the curious 1927 film adaptation that Bhagat Singh urged his co-conspirators to watch. The film that Bhagat Singh saw in Lahore features scenes and actions entirely original to the 1927 iteration, scenes and plot lines that appear neither in Stowe's novel nor in the other 12 adaptations produced between 1903 and 1926. The 1927 film was a product of extensive market research as well as a series of fortunate accidents. Universal Pictures knew that audiences across the United States would have been deeply familiar with the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin, therefore making it an easy silent picture to make. Additionally, the stage version of Uncle Tom's Cabin had toured the US and the UK multiple times, multiple versions, and with multiple successes. Executives at Universal Pictures knew that audiences wanted another Uncle Tom's film, but they also knew that those audiences would want the film to do something more and go beyond previous adaptations. The film's budget was set at $200,000, which is approximately about $2.7 million today, which required the widest possible distribution in order to recoup its expenses. This meant that a single film had to appeal to abolitionists in the North and still loyal Confederates in the South, as well as action sequences that would have been only recently technologically possible. Harry A. Pollard, a low-ranking Universal Pictures director, and also the titular character in blackface of the 1913 Uncle Tom's Cabin, allegedly took over after D.W. Griffiths unsurprisingly turned down the script. To appeal to Southern viewers, Pollard made sure the film had enough elements from a minstrel show, primarily in the character of Topsy, who is slave girl in blackface, who is the slapstick protagonist of the first 12 minutes of the film, to, quote, overcome its ultimately abolitionist message. The scene that makes 1927 film famous for film historians is Eliza's escape sequence over a frozen river, shot on a frozen and particularly treacherous stretch of the Saranac in upstate New York, and then again on one of the most expensive stage lots at the time. The scene that makes the 1927 film important for, I think, our current consideration is a mostly forgotten fever dream sequence in the second half of the movie. After beating Uncle Tom to death, Simon Legree sits down to drink, only to have the ghost of Uncle Tom haunt him. So you can see that here. The text of Uncle Tom's dying words of Christian forgiveness, quote, I forgive you as I hope to be forgiven, offers the cut between the mourning slave's cabin and the beginning of Legree's unraveling. To Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, a required element of the studio-circulated soundtrack, at least in the US, the ghosts of Legree's former slaves appeared, crawling from his head, coming down the stairs, peering in through the window. Legree falls to his death after chasing the ghost of Uncle Tom, seen here, through a second-story window. We see his fall, and then the film cuts to Union soldiers bombarding Legree's foyer, marking the end of slavery. By that. The film makes literal the metaphorical death of Simon Legree, which occurs in the novel, so Simon Legree does not die in the novel. It's Legree's way of life that dies in the novel instead, not Legree himself. In the movie, however, we see that Legree's death is caused not only by the horror of slavery, but by his individual madness, his alcoholism, and his superstition, that he sees ghosts, right? He chases the ghosts of past slaves, including Uncle Tom, around the house until he falls to his death. Legree's death in this reading is caused by flagrant overconsumption. He beats Uncle Tom to death, and he drinks to the point of hallucination. By extension, the shared concerns of the 19th century, abolition and prohibition, stand in kind of direct line with Christian principles manifested in Uncle Tom of martyrdom and forgiveness. In this sense, the ghosts of the recalcitrant slaves portend Legree's death by illuminating the juxtaposition of self-sacrifice of black slaves with the prolificity of white supremacy. Both result in human death, but one is morally righteous and one is morally hollow. It's worth mentioning that the film can only imagine dead black people properly fighting against a bad white person. It is only through their self-sacrificial death that black people are allowed to identify singular moments of racial injustice. The film, much like the novel, is unable to imagine black lives as mattering. The film, going beyond the novel, identifies the death of a singularly, explicitly prodigal white person with a successful elimination of racial prejudice altogether. So Legree's horrificness stands in for racism. This is likely the reading that was most available to predominantly white US audiences who might have merely viewed Legree's mental deterioration as a result of his moral turpitude. To my mind, it would have been this fairly apolitical reading that allowed the film to circulate in South Asia at the height of anti-colonial fervor. The British Raj had already kind of connected anti-colonialism and anti-racism in their files, and so it's not the anti-racism that's at stake here. At the same time, the cuts, I can show you this in Q&A, the cuts suggest a narrative relationship that the ghosts of the recalcitrant slaves not simply portend, but in fact engender the death of Legree and the end of his despotic rule. In this sense, the ghosts of slaves are actually rebelling and are the direct cause of Legree's death. Uncle Tom's Ghost appears not as Legree's intoxicated hallucination, but as an actual revenge-seeking spirit. This is the only scene where anything remotely resembling, quote, the blacks' fights for their freedom in America occurs in the 1927 film. Martyrdom in the Punjabi context has greater implications for the downfall of injustice than it tends to in the Christian context. Recall that it is, in fact, the death of Lala Lajpat Rai is imagined as finally ending the British Empire. It is therefore not unreasonable to associate the ghost of Uncle Tom haunting Legree with forms of political resistance in violent self-sacrifice. It is therefore likely that this would have been the scene that Bhagat Singh, or at least Bhagwan Das Mahur, would have described as the cornerstone of a revolutionary film. I think a focus on the 1927 film adaptation of Uncle Tom's Cabin in Lahore reveals a more expansive canon of anti-colonial literature than we have heretofore allowed revolutionaries to possess. In the interest of resuscitating anti-colonial thought as the predecessor of post-colonial theory, itself an inheritance we often forget, we have tended to focus on the philosophical density of anti-imperial critique, or on its relationship to literary and aesthetic avant-garde movements and experiments in the North Atlantic world. This body of scholarship has produced fantastic work. In intellectual history, it has drawn necessary comparisons between M.K. Gandhi and 19th century radical philosophers, as well as interwar European pessimistic utopianists. In literary studies, it has rightly extended the genre of the manifesto, the modernist genre of the manifesto, and experimental writing styles well beyond the boundaries of Europe. Quite rightly so, it has attempted to correct what Pascal Casanova diagnoses and herself occasionally performs as the hierarchies in violence, various forms of violence that the World Republic of Letters produces. It has also allowed for a proper refutation of that old allegation of aesthetic colonial belatedness by suggesting that the literary qualities of political texts reveal an aesthetic practice very much alive in London and in its colonies concurrently. On the other hand, this has been very much in response to a remaining desire to re-universalize Europe, whereby anti-colonial thought is valued only insofar as it can be dubbed high theory or high modernism, and therefore somehow equivalent with the European masters of 19th and 20th century philosophy, or worse, better by half. Such forms of mastery, I think, are totally antithetical to the truly anti-authoritarian practices of radical Indian anti-colonial writing, which consistently sought to undermine notions of authority in both political and aesthetic realms. Furthermore, this has tended to backfire. Post-colonial theory has been dogged by accusations of obscurantism and obfuscation since its origins in the 1980s. Such critics claim that it is elitist and vanguard, or alternatively, that it is insufficiently political to be of use. By attempting to recuperate anti-colonial writing as aligning with high Europeanist modernist aesthetics and philosophy, post-colonial studies scholars accidentally retreat into the equally untenable positions of, on the one hand, sacrificing the aesthetics of anti-colonialism to the joylessness of a utilitarian dispensation, or, on the other, replicating the very aesthetic hierarchies, canons, and authorities, even with new faces and names, that anti-colonial thought had attempted to undermine in the first place. In response, I want to suggest a variety of anti-colonial thought, a strain of anti-colonial thought indebted to the allegedly middle-brow engagements with the post-war modernity's continued wrestling with its genteel and sentimentalist inheritance, Uncle Tom's Cabin, even if this tradition was considerably less marked outside of the North Atlantic world than within it. In this sense, recovering the full spectrum of texts rendered anti-colonial requires that we go beyond the most obvious influences and citations, Lenin, Marx, Proudhon, that already fit neatly into our current conception of political philosophy. To this end, we should endeavor to develop a more historically sensitive canon of anti-colonial writing that includes texts antithetical to, or at least texts that sit uncomfortably with, our notion of the properly political. I propose, therefore, that we understand Uncle Tom's Cabin as an anti-colonial text. This requires, of course, that we treat the circulation of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the bibliomigrancy of Uncle Tom's Cabin, as more important than the text itself, and as possessing afterlives that neither Stone, nor Lincoln, nor Pollard could have predicted. It also requires that we provincialize rather than universalize the politics of American literature. It also requires, more frustratingly, the relinquishing of our own critical authority in favor of Bhagat Singh's generous cinematic reading, especially of a text with such overdetermined historical influence. To my knowledge, there is no record of Bhagat Singh's very impressive lecture after the HRSA watched Uncle Tom's Cabin together. Nevertheless, that Bhagat Singh, as well as other members of the HRSA, found roughly the same political import in the film that they found in Marx, Lenin, and Proudhon, should alert us to an anti-colonial politics of aesthetic consumption that has little regard for the hierarchies of that literary studies continues to press upon the past. Part 2, aesthetics. On the other hand, silent film in the 1920s was hardly considered literature, even if its purview was the world. I'm not suggesting an uncomplicated lineage between silent film and what we now consider to be the world canon of world literature, even if one exists today. In the 1920s, these were two irreconcilable media, one high, one low. In India, the division would have been even more pronounced. Given that literacy rates were low, print culture, let alone Anglophone print culture, and therefore access to something called world literature, was restricted to a very small set of fairly elite Indians. Silent film, on the other hand, required no ability to read in any language and no need to learn English. William Mazzarella argues that the cinema bridged the gap between print and public festival in India because, quote, it united in an explosive way the mass reach of print with the corporeal appeal of theatrical and ritual performance. Indeed, in the 1920s, film was seen as the modern corruption not only of literature proper, but of humanity in general. The popularity of film was also a sign of its devastating influence on the allegedly mindless audience it produced. Non-elite audiences were especially at risk. In the US, a staff writer for The New Yorker complained that the film produced loose women. It was a medium that celebrated short and easy relationships with entertainment rather than the long, arduous fidelity required of a Victorian novel. In India, Oxbridge-educated men suggested that the film was too corrupting of Indian masses and would produce brainless servants to the British Raj. The irony of having received an Oxbridge education when I mentioned. British colonial censors, whose job it was to prevent the circulation of inappropriate and overly political films in South Asia, worried about the moral instability of the colonized. With equal disdain for Indians in the nascent Hollywood industry, the British Raj worried that film in general would ruin the impressionable minds of, quote, childlike subjects. Indians, especially in cities, were going to the movies in astounding numbers. In 1927, American films made up 80% of films shown in British India. The British were especially worried that American filmic eroticism and egalitarianism would undermine British colonial rule by promoting democratic participation. In its defense, Hollywood published a 35-page memo to the Indian Cinematography Committee, ICC, defending cinema as, quote, innocuous entertainment, a defense that the ICC finally agreed with. In short, film was fun. It needn't possess politics at all. Perhaps it's in this vein that Bhagat Singh was a moviegoer before he was a martyr. Sukhdev Raj recalls in his memoirs, quote, Bhagat Singh was very fond of films. He always tried to see the first show of every film exhibited in the town. The class of the film didn't matter. Third class was as good as first class. It was the film that mattered. Might we imagine then a Bhagat Singh in line with the steep dandyism of Oscar Wilde, celebrating art for art's sake, and therefore claiming that the only relationship between the aesthetic as pleasure and the politics was a disavowal of one relationship at all. So to recover the aesthetic pleasure of anti-colonial critique is to rescue anti-colonial thought from the dismal post-colonial anti-aesthetic political pragmatism, whereby all anti-colonial writing is condemned to be only politically useful rather than enjoyable. To follow Bhagat Singh to the movies is to enjoy the aesthetics of anti-imperial critique rather than to sacrifice them to the dry rubrics of colonial recognition. If Hollywood film aestheticized a particular American brand of democratic and patriotic life, the Bombay film industry, and later Bollywood, aestheticized a type of urbane existence. From oral history sources, we also know that Bhagat Singh enjoyed films, especially those starring Jewish actress Ruby Myers, who worked in the Bombay film industry as Sulochana. This is her here. He especially loved The Wild Cat of Bombay, which was released silently in 1927 and then released again with sound as Bombay Ki Billi in 1936, wherein Sulochana plays 8 different characters, some of whom are Indian men and some of whom are British spies. Sulochana plays the Wildcat, a sexy murderer who evades British police by her cunning disguises: a gardener, a policeman, a Hyderabadi gentleman, a street urchin, a European blonde, a banana seller, and an expert pickpocket. Neither edition of the film has survived, but Todd has helped me try to track it down. Thank you, Todd. What does survive the Wildcat of Bombay, which is this, is a collection of telling images for reconstructing Bhagat Singh's anti-colonial aesthetic imaginary. Kamal MacLean has written extensively about the production and circulation of Bhagat Singh's famous and attractive studio portrait, the one that is on all the posters. Similarly, which was made that image was made in early 1929 at Ramnath Photographers at Delhi. Similarly, Chris Penny has argued that Bhagat Singh's visual appeal is in his cosmopolitan mimicry of the white Sahib, made even more compelling by the story of his escape from Lahore by evading the police in 1929. Neither MacLean nor Penny speculate on Bhagat Singh's aesthetic inspiration for his famous studio portrait. In oral history testimonies held at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, however, many of Bhagat Singh's colleagues in the 1970s recalled how important Sulochana was for the revolutionary martyr and how much he loved the Wildcat of Bombay. McLean and Penny's lack of speculation is likely due to their scholarly rigor, which thankfully I don't possess. But it also might be that a narrow conception of revolutionary politics and imperial recognition blinds them to the aesthetic pleasures of Bhagat Singh's more expansive revolutionary thought. Thus, what scholars dismiss as a late adolescent crush, even if it was repeated throughout many accounts, might actually offer us the key to finally unpacking the famous iconography of the HSRA. What then can we make of Sulochana's Sardarji, whose pose in the remaining Regalia looks astoundingly like the 1930s iconography of Chandrasekhar Azad? Here. What to make of Sulochana's British detective, whose studio portrait looks astoundingly like the same colonial drag Bhagat Singh would successfully accomplish 2 years after the film's release. In our attempt to render Bhagat Singh the proper South Asian inheritor of revolutionary tradition, I've said this multiple times now, we insist that he aligned with Marx, Lenin, Proudhon, and Mazzini. There's no doubt that he read these great men of revolutionary thought. His writings attest to the extent to which he was inspired by the British, Irish, and Bolshevik anarchist successes. Nevertheless, these citations conform to the presentist hubris in intellectual history to know in advance what counts as intellectual across time. These citations and influences should not, therefore, prevent us from offering a history of Bhagat Singh the aesthete, whose love of film could be aesthetic without needing to be instantly convertible to politics. In this sense, we might imagine a Bhagat Singh who might be equally indebted to a Jewish woman in drag as to the pamphlets of Vladimir Lenin. An anti-colonial critique that relishes in the aestheticism draws us closer to the poetic offerings of an anti-imperial writing tradition, rather than, on the one hand, relinquishing the aesthetics of critique to the rubrics of political pragmatism, or, on the other, forcing the expansive vision of anti-colonial critique to fit neatly within our fairly rigid post-colonial scholarly expectations. Part 3. Bhagat Singh's cinephilia allows us a way to draw out the importance of the cinematic experience for bridging the gap between the, quote, merely political, as I was arguing in the first section, and merely aesthetic, as I was arguing in the second. In this sense, allow me to suggest that Bhagat Singh, as both a martyr and a moviegoer, bridges the allegedly insuperable, not to mention gendered and raced, barrier between sentimental aesthetics and political revolution. Because there appears to be no recording of Bhagat Singh's lecture on Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's difficult to say whether he could be situated in a lineage of the steep dandyism of Oscar Wilde, the political optimism of Jacques Rancière, or the political pessimism of Theodore Adorno. In any case, such a concern is rather beside the point. That Bhagat Singh liked going to the movies, that Bhagat Singh loved going to the movies, and going to the movies with his colleagues and friends, should offer us an implicit theory of movie-going that revels in the collective effervescence of the cinematic experience. This is to suggest two things, I think. One, that movie-going allowed a certain type of affective community to come into fleeting existence in the contagious space of the cinema hall. And two, that aesthetics, differently conceived, rested in the chaotic cacophony of a readerly interpretation. Whereas print culture faces and creates the limits of nationalism based on language, as Benedict Anderson has famously argued, the silent cinema is a work of art's mechanical reproducibility can create a mass, imagined community of viewers well beyond the restrictions of the nation. If a radical non-nationalist and anti-authorial politics could be heralded under the rubrics of collective reading, as I've argued that Bhagat Singh argues, movie-going in the age of silent cinema might name a kind of similar form of aesthetic consumption that produces and traces an anti-authoritarian and cosmopolitan anti-colonial sensibility. The importance of cinema, as Miriam Hansen has argued, is that it becomes, in the early 20th century, quote, the most advanced cultural institution in which the masses, as a relatively heterogeneous, undefined, and as yet little understood form of collectivity, constitute a new form of public. In other words, the experience of cinema, not simply cinema in and of itself, is the nexus of aesthetics and politics of film. In other words, the elective affinity of strangers gathering together at motion pictures to become anonymous yet collective viewers of a film suggests a more radical form of spectatorship than we tend to allow. In this sense, spectatorship emerges as a politics of anonymous viewership, aesthetic judgment, and reception. It stands in direct opposition to more overtly formed political forms of liberalism, which tend to be rooted in individual recognition, individual mastery, and individual critique. The cinema offers a space of collective unknowability, anonymity, and contagious cosmopolitan affect. I've argued elsewhere that Bhagat Singh's notion of the masses drew on both contemporaneous sociological, political, and anarchist thought that was very much in vogue in the global interwar period. Bhagat Singh, like most of his fellow radicals around the world, viewed crowds and masses as metonymically related to a cosmopolitan vision of humanity more broadly, and argued for the egalitarian importance in remaining in rather than transcending the anonymous mob. As a new sociological unit, around the turn of the 20th century, the crowd neither an individual entity nor a sum of individuals, but something in addition to both, appealed to and frustrated radical thinkers around the world. The elective affinities, rather than filial obligations or national obligations, that marked the collective effervescence of masses meant that the new political subjectivities beyond liberalism, as well as beyond the nation, might be cultivated under the rubrics of the public mass. In the space of the cinema theater, audience members felt themselves to be sharing in a common mass experience, that is, watching a film. In the age of silent films, this sensation was global in scope. Silent cinema experience, in other words, proffered a feeling of being part of a global egalitarian community of moviegoers. In this final sense, it is in this final sense that I think Bhagat Singh's commitment to cosmopolitanism was quintessentially modern and global. It was rooted in the truly common experience of going to the movies. The British Raj, of course, also understood the cinema as a space of social contagion, especially in Indian cities, where the ground floor in front of the screen would be crowded, loud, and possibly dangerous. Reports of cinema audiences in Delhi in the 1920s record acts of communal eating, sharing snacks, and intercaste touching, which would be actually really radical. Discerning Indians and British bureaucrats could purchase more expensive seats safely located in the balcony, where social mixing was less of a threat. Bhagat Singh, as his colleague notes, enjoyed the ground floor. Bhagat Singh's vibrant, if implicit, theory of the cinematic experience then stands in direct opposition to his more famous interlocutor, M.K. Gandhi. Gandhi, responding to a questionnaire by the ICC in 1928, offers a fairly tedious theory of the cinematic experience. And this is Gandhi. I have never been to the cinema, but even to an outsider, the evil that it has done and is doing is patent. The good, if it has done any at all, remains to be proved. It would be too simplistic a task to characterize Gandhi's stance as anti-modern. He was far more complicated and bigger than that. I think, however, that we can identify in Gandhi's flippant reply a philosophy that hews closer to the pragmatic logics of colonial rule than he usually allows. First, Gandhi separates himself from the movie-going masses, whose anonymity remains below the realm of usable politics. Secondly, by alternatively suggesting or demanding that films do something on their own, Gandhi requires aesthetic and sentimental pleasures be answerable to political or moral value that is yet to be accrued. Bhagat Singh, on the other hand, reveled in the experience of cinema as a moment of mass collectivity, wherein he can imagine, if probably erroneously, Black Americans, white Americans, and Indians simultaneously coming together around the world to watch poor Eliza. Bhagat Singh's love of American popular culture marks a global egalitarian imagination without regard to the hierarchies of canon and the confines of authorship post-colonial literary criticism has tended to demarcate and demand. Instead, we might, with Bhagat Singh, think through the broader implications of the sphere of the political as we apply it to the late colonial, anti-colonial, revolutionary thought in South Asia, and as part of a global intellectual history that recenters anti-imperial critique as foundational to a globalized modernity, and vice versa. Rooted equally in Vladimir Lenin as it is in Harriet Beecher Stowe, Bhagat Singh's imagination offers us a more capacious and historically sensitive account of what revolutionary politics and aesthetics might have been. Thank you.